This is FX Radio and I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. And with me in the studio today is none other than Dr. Mark Houston, a cardiologist of great renown. Mark is Associate Professor of Clinical Medicine at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine. He's the Director of the Hypertension Institute of Vascular Biology and also the Director of Nutrition at St. Thomas Hospital in Tennessee. So Mark, I welcome you warmly.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here.
Mark, first I'd like to get an idea of your history. You're a cardiologist. What piqued your interest to say there's something more going on here than the normal things that we were taught in medical school?
I realized that most of the people who were being treated for coronary heart disease, who'd had myocardial infarctions, bypass grafting, stents and everything, they were just having issues with restenosis or recurrence of their disease, even though they had really good numbers. I mean, by normal LDL levels, good blood pressure, good blood sugars, they were losing weight, they were eating right. And I said, we're missing something. Something's not being measured. And so I started looking into the literature, and I realized that we were not addressing all of the risk factors that we even knew about correctly. And we weren't even addressing another 395 that we didn't even address at all.
So, you know, if we go back in history, there was a time where they only measured total cholesterol because that's all they could. Then they discovered, oh, hang on, there's these fractions of cholesterol, or lipoproteins really. And then they said, well, let's finally look at the LDL and the HDL and the VLDL and the ILDL. Mainly looking at the HDL and the LDL particles. And then that evolved into the subfractions of each moiety. So was there a great resistance in the initial development of, oh, hang on, we've got to look at high density and low density? Was that same resistance there that we're seeing now with the particle size? Yeah,
we've gone through an incredible transformation. The entire field of lipidology is in flux. And we've gone from, as you say, total cholesterol, then went to LDL and HDL, and now we've gone to the subfractions of each of those, and now that's even gotten more complicated, looking at modifications of those, dysfunctionality of the HDL. So the entire field is in flux, and I think that we are beginning to realize we really don't know much about lipidology compared to what we thought we knew. And so the whole field with advanced lipid testing is evolving. And that's going to create another whole field, because when we get into that, we're going to realize there's a lot of stuff that we don't know about that, and that's going to create another whole level of concern. So I think we're just on the, like I said, on the precipice of understanding not just CVD, but understanding lipidology.
Yeah, and to move on from that, you know, there was the gainsayers of any usefulness of lipid particle size will say, well, the Epic Norfolk trial looked at this, and they said there's no real effect when you regress when you analyze it down. And yet just recently, February 2014, the first author was Grammer, published in the European Heart Journal. They looked at particle size and they said, no, there's definitely a call for this. So now you're saying it's got to do with dysfunctionality of these particle sizes and also modification. Tell me more about
this. If you look at the LDL story, for example, the driving risk for coronary heart disease and MI is LDL particle number. Now, if your particle number is elevated, the particle size is also a confounding variable. So they're both important.
Right.
But if you drive the particle number down to a really low level, the particle size loses its ability to predict coronary heart disease.
Right.
The particle number never loses its predictability. It's always number one no matter what you do. But within the LDL story, there's the functionality of the LDL. By that I mean it's modified. It's changed by inflammation and oxidative stress. So the oxidized form, the acetylated form, the glycated form actually become the foreign type of LDL.
Yeah.
So LDL in its native form is really not even atherogenic, whether it's big or small. It just turns out that the little ones are more likely to become modified than the big ones.
Right.
But even the big ones can be atherogenic under certain circumstances, like inflammation.
Okay. So when you're talking about particle number then, is that the same as looking at just LDL?
No, it's totally different. If you look at total LDL, you cannot predict anything, in my opinion, about risk nor can you predict what the treatment is going to do, and how far you need to drive the LDL down.
Yeah.
So total levels, no matter where you're looking at, HDL or LDL, to my reading, are non-useful information.
Well, that's basically, we've got the 40% residual risk. Yeah. But when you look at that and they say, well, the proponents of looking of normal lipoprotein levels will say, well, what we have to do is drive down these levels even further. So they're calling for lower levels of LDL, as you'd be aware. What do you say to your peers? What do you say to them to say, hang on, there's another story here?
Well, the problem is all of those studies are based on total LDL levels. And what we found is if you get the LDL particle number down, depending on the lab, we use one that gets it down about 700. That's where the risk becomes pretty flat. Mm-hmm. But that's not the whole story. It's what happens to the particles, how they change, and also the cleanup crew, which is HDL, and is it functional? So it's way more complicated than just looking at LDL. Yeah. And if you start saying, well, we're going to drive the LDL down to these enormously low levels, you're going to start interfering with all kinds of biochemical pathways. Mm. And there's going to be long-term problems with that. You're going to have changes in vitamin D levels, steroid hormones. I mean, all these things that are downstream that you have to have. We have LDL for a good reason.
For a good reason, yeah.
And
one of the initial theories of the function of LDL was that it's actually a healer. It's actually trying to get rid of inflammation. Can you explain this?
Absolutely. It's a very good point, actually, and we didn't have time to really cover that today in our conference, but LDL is actually a protective defense mechanism. It's actually part of your innate immune system. Yeah. So, for example, if you're infected with a virus or a bacteria, one of the first responses is LDL try to contain the infection. And it will take it, incorporate it into the LDL, so the polysaccharide coat of the bacteria is incorporated into the LDL, mm-hmm. and the LDL then goes to the liver and tries to get rid of the infection or whatever it is. Yeah. And the problem is, while it's doing all that, it becomes altered, becomes oxidized, it becomes glycated or whatever. And then the body sees the particle as a foreign protein. And so unless it gets out of the system somehow, it's still floating around, then it's going to become a foreign antigen. The body's going to start attacking the LDL, or the LDL is going to create a secondary inflammatory response over and above the first one. So what I was saying today in the conference is that LDL is not the bad guy. LDL is trying to protect you, but it becomes part of the damage, and your vascular system becomes the innocent bystander as part of the modification of your LDL cholesterol.
So it's kind of like a post-traumatic stress disorder of lipoproteins.
Yeah, that's probably a very good way to put it, actually. Yeah.
So many around the world are calling for a rethink of BMI as a measure of lean body mass. What simple tests do you advocate to say, let's look at your body composition?
There's a lot of things you can do. BMI, as you know, misses people who have a lot of lean muscle mass, overpredicts their body BMI. So we typically use waist circumference, waist-hip ratio, but even that's fraught with problems. Mm. The really best is to do BIA, body impedance analysis, and actually measure their percent body fat and their visceral fat. That's the most accurate.
And is there any, I understand there's a few machines on the market. There's a 12-channel one, is that right? Or
mm-hmm. Yeah, there's several ones.
Right.
They're, as long as you have a good machine, it only takes 1 minute to get a good analysis of the total fat, and it regionalizes it as well.
Oh, okay, brilliant. I remember a talk back in 2004 that you gave at the Institute of Functional Medicine on diabetes, obesity, and insulin resistance. And it really piqued my interest that we should be doing more with regards to fasting glucose and looking at the acceptable levels, which you discussed today in the Bioceutical Symposium. Can you tell me a little bit more about where we're going with that and what changes you see when you achieve those targets of a lower fasting glucose?
We've really misdefined dysglycemia in every lab. By the time your blood sugar is in the high normal range, you've already lost a lot of your insulin production. Mm. So you got to back it up and say, what's really a normal fasting blood sugar? It's somewhere around 75 to 80 milligram per deciliter. You can convert that into the metric system.
I have a conversion.
But anyway, So that's the story on that. But for example, in the United States, our upper limit for fasting blood sugar is 99.
Right.
Okay, so the point is, if you're at 99, you're already at risk for cardiovascular disease. And it's a 1-to-1 ratio. It's a 1 point on your milligram per deciliter per 1% increase in risk for myocardial infarction. So if you're at 100, you're almost 25% greater risk for having a heart attack. Now, if you do a postprandial blood sugar or a 2-hour glucose tolerance test, it's even worse.
Yep.
It now becomes a 2-to-1 ratio. And so the earliest markers for dysglycemia are adiponectin. And then the next thing that happens is your insulin levels start to go up, but your blood sugar remains fairly normal.
Yep.
And then once your insulin can't keep up, the blood sugar goes up. And that's when you've already progressed pretty far.
Yep.
So the time you have fasting dysglycemia, you've already lost probably 25-30% of your insulin function.
And now, is that? Do you ever measure like C-peptide?
I do. I measure C-peptide, proinsulin, insulin, adiponectin, fasting, and postprandial glucose pretty routinely, depending on kind of where they are on the curve. And it gives you a very good idea of how bad they are and how far they've progressed.
I should tell the listeners that I found a conversion for US to Australian levels. So at 80 milligrams per deciliter, that's around about 4.4 millimoles per litre. And the 95 milligrams per deciliter was, I think it was 5.6 millimoles per litre. So if you take that to an Australian thing, I think what we've got to have point out is that this is a fasting glucose level.
Yes.
This is not just doing a glucometer reading just after a meal or anything where, it can go up to 6 quite happily without that. So I just caution the listeners that this is a fasting glucose level.
And do remember that there is a discrepancy between fasting and postprandial. Some people can be out of range on one but not the other.
Yep.
So it's really important to do both.
Okay. Is this where the glycemic clamp?
Well, that's research oriented.
Right.
The HOMA clamp is research. You typically don't do that, in your clinical practice.
Okay, so let's move on to dietary intervention, because this is really where, if we think about the causes of it, a lot of it comes from that and sedentary lifestyle. Now, in your book, What Your Doctor May Not Tell You About Heart Disease, you talk about the ABCT program. And you also talk about a diet which you've developed, which sort of blends two of the best diets together, the Mediterranean diet and the DASH2. It's called the ICD-PPD diet. Can you explain what's going on here?
Yes. What actually, when you look at most of the diets that have been out there and studied, they have some issues. For example, the old DASH diet was way too high in refined carbohydrates. So I modified that to a lower carbohydrate and made a few other twists.
Yep.
And the Mediterranean diet has a few things that you want to modify as well. So taking the two together, the best of both of them. So basically what I did is I had very high quality protein that's organic preferably. And then you use no trans fats whatsoever. You limit the saturated fats, and you really load up with monounsaturated fats and omega-3 fatty acids. And then the carbohydrates is a very important issue. Refined carbohydrates, in my opinion, are much more important in driving coronary heart disease risk than anything related to the fat story.
Yep.
If you look at saturated fats versus refined carbs are always worse than saturated fats.
Yep.
And if you transport the calorie intake per day and you substitute refined for the saturated fat, you can end up with more heart disease, no question about it. So I'm really tough on patients when it comes to refined carbs. I try to get them down to 75 to 100 grams a day max.
Yep.
And that's really low end.
Yep.
And then we get a lot of vegetables, different colors. Minimize the fruit because that's fructose and it gets converted right into glucose. So berries are better. You got to watch the glycemic index of the fruits like bananas and so forth.
Yep. Grapes.
Yeah. So those things have to be modified. So it's what's within the story. You don't just say, well, eat 10 servings of fruits and vegetables. They say, well, tell me which vegetables to eat, tell me which fruits to eat. Tell me how many grams of refined carbs I don't go over.
Yeah. I love Lise Alschler's way of putting it. She says, I like to eat a rainbow every day.
Exactly.
Lots of these darker sort of berries.
And if you do the rainbow, you're going to have a pot of gold at the end.
So tell me more about the ABCT program, because something that I really picked up on when I heard you speak at the Institute of Functional Medicine 2012 on cardiovascular disease, and something that piqued my interest was that you said do the strength exercising before the cardio exercising.
Right.
Tell me what's going on there.
Yeah. We recommend doing an hour, at least 4 days a week. 40 minutes is resistance training, and that's first, followed by 20 minutes of interval aerobics. Now, the reason you do it a 2-to-1 ratio and you do the resistance first, there's some good studies that show that if you do it that way, you increase your vascular endothelial production of nitric oxide and enhance arterial compliance and vascular health. If you do it the other way, you don't get the same benefit.
So what other things do you use? What other tricks do you use in the ABCT program?
Well,
a lot of it's got to do with muscle, which muscle groups you use.
It's basically a combined resistance aerobic program in the resistance program. So what you're doing is heavy weights with low reps, and then you start to drop the weights and do higher reps. So what you're doing is really a combined program, and what you'll find is the muscle fatigue that occurs where you get the lactic acid burn, and that's when you start increasing the beneficial hormones out of skeletal muscle, like interleukin-10 and others that are anti-inflammatory. They increase growth hormone, they increase testosterone in women, progesterone and estrogen, and they drop the catabolic hormones, particularly cortisol and epinephrine. And by doing so, the muscle becomes really a key endocrine organ in reducing cardiovascular disease.
And does that have any action on triggering the activity of brown fat at all? Like, you know, how this is raising its head again as a...
Yeah, when you do this type of program, you enhance fat burning and increase lean muscle mass just by the sheer mechanism of the way you're doing the exercise program.
What sort of things do you sort of tend to institute first? What nutraceutical supplements do you tend to use first in your patients to say, right, we've got your diet, you're adhering to your diet, you've got your exercise program. What sort of things do you say, let's first act on these?
Well, I almost routinely put people on omega-3 fatty acids. And the reason I do that is they have so many vast effects on lipids, blood pressure, insulin resistance, and other things. Yeah. Magnesium is also important, CoQ10. And if you're talking about specific entities, for example, dyslipidemia, what I found a combination of red yeast rice, berberine, and niacin and phytosterols really will drop the LDL particle number dramatically. And I can compete with statins as far as the numbers when I do those combinations without all the downsides. And you just decide the same thing with blood pressure. There's certain nutrients that will rival drugs if you know how to put them together.
Yeah. I've always been very interested in the work of William Harris with the omega-3 index. And I really think that's going to be like a new hero.
Well, we routinely measure it. I mean, everybody gets omega-3 index. And no one's normal.
Do you find great improvements, though, on quite judicious dosages?
Yeah, you don't have to get huge amounts. Most people don't get enough in their diet, so it doesn't take a lot of... You know, I use a combination of diet and supplements, but you have to pick really high-quality supplements because some of the omega-3s are either in balance or they're full of mercury, lead, arsenic, or some other nasty things.
Yeah. Mark Houston, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today.
All right, thank you, Andrew.
This is FX Radio, and I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook.